A few days back, French President Emmanuel Macron made a ridiculous and insulting remark about countries in the Sahel region. Macron's statement was a reflection of the typical paternalistic attitude that the West has shown African countries for centuries. These people believe that Africans are beneath them and that they know better than Africans. However, since Macron made his ridiculous remarks, African leaders in the Sahel region have hit back at him. Recently, President Traore gave a strong speech in an interview where he blasted Macron and revealed some shocking truths about Macron's statement. So, what did President Traore reveal? Let's find out. President Traore said, "When I recently heard the words of Emmanuel Macron, I realized that every conscious African needs to understand quickly what he means. General Tiani said not long ago that France simply decided to change its tactics and strategies in Africa. This new tactic is about dissolving some certain elements but keeping a strong foundation in Africa, and Emmanuel Macron simply confirmed this in his speech, which we should thank him for." So, President Traore is saying that France is telling the world through the media that it is withdrawing its military from Africa. But the reality is that France is simply changing its tactics on how to retain its hold on Africa. So, how does France plan to do this? Well, President Traore reveals that in his speech where he said, "They will not leave some countries. They have just dissolved the system. You will no longer see them in bases, but in the embassy they will be there. They will build security companies to secure the companies that exist in these countries. But the soldiers will be there. You will no longer see them in uniform or gathered in bases. That's all it means. They will reorganize, but they will be there." This is deep, and if you think about it, it does make sense. In a country like Ivory Coast where the leader is a puppet, it did not make sense at all that France would just decide to withdraw without any backup plan. That's why we said in our previous video that France decided to leave Ivory Coast so that it could create the narrative that it wasn't kicked out of any African countries but decided to leave by itself. But leaving doesn't mean that France would have nothing to do with Ivory Coast. As Traore said, it's simply a matter of tactics. Traore went on to say that Macron spoke of politeness towards certain heads of state by giving them the primacy of announcing the breakup or departure of the French forces, but it doesn't matter to us. This is quite interesting. If you recall in the statement made by Macron, he said that France was not kicked out of the Sahel region. According to Macron, France simply decided to reorganize its African strategy. In his own words, no, France is not on the back foot in Africa. It is just lucid and reorganizing itself. Macron also implied that France already decided to withdraw from the Sahel countries, but decided to allow the countries to announce that they were kicking France out. How exactly does this make sense, and who does Macron want to fool? African countries kicking out French troops and ending things with France humiliated France on the global scene. So how possible is it that France would allow these countries to say something like that if it were not true? Macron is obviously lying and trying to save face. The only country that France can boldly say it decided to leave is Ivory Coast. We all know that the president of Ivory Coast is a French puppet and would never dream of telling France to leave the country. This is why Macron had the boldness to say that some African countries did not want France to leave. Before we proceed, here is a reminder to like this video, drop a comment, and subscribe to our channel so that you can get more videos like this. Now, as Traore said, it doesn't matter. Traore went on to highlight how the Sahel countries kicked out French forces, referencing Chad as an example. He said, "If you want to break up with these imperialist forces, it's simple. We denounce the agreement. It all starts there." I think that the example of Chad in any case is palpable. They started by denouncing the agreements. Otherwise, if we don't denounce the agreement and just say that the base is leaving, we haven't done anything. Now, what does this tell you? It means that France did not truly leave Ivory Coast. If you have been following the news, in the case of Niger, Mali, Burkina Faso, and even Chad, the report was always that these countries ended the defense agreement with France, which has been existing since colonial times. For Ivory Coast, however, the report was simply that France withdrew its troops from the country. In simple terms, the idea that France has left Ivory Coast is a sham. The only places that France has truly left are Niger, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Chad, because these countries denounced the defense agreement they had with France. What an eye-opening statement made by Traore. But that's not all Traore revealed. Traore said, The problem is in the colonial agreements signed since independence. The most dangerous are not the ones you see in bases. The most dangerous are the military advisors who exist in all these countries. They existed in Burkina Faso until the end of 2022 when we took responsibility. But who are these fierce military advisors? These are the ones who are supposed to put France's policy into practice. They work to make our enemies very weak so that France can always have the argument to exist here. Under Blaise Compaoré, they succeeded. This is very true, and it is quite ironic that Macron in his statement said that French forces helped to build the armies of the Sahel. But if you have been following the news, you would know that all the armies of the Sahel countries, including Burkina Faso, were the worst when France was still in their countries. In fact, according to research, France purposely refused to allow these countries to upgrade their military equipment. In Burkina Faso, the Minister of Defense revealed that France stopped Burkina Faso from getting good weapons so many times, and even when they got weapons, the weapons were costly and useless. If France truly helped the armies of the Sahel, why did Burkina Faso have to borrow weapons from neighboring African countries to equip their soldiers? France is truly the worst thing that has happened to these countries. As Traore stated, France did all these so that it could have an argument on why it should be in these countries. But the coups changed everything. Still speaking, Traore said, "That's what France wants from our armies, and when we get to this stage, we don't have a choice but to want them to settle." However, the Burkinabe army managed to get rid of these French military advisors. Unfortunately, I think that in 2010, after the operation at Tapuano, when the French saw that the Burkinabe army still had the capacity to react to terrorism, they called the Burkinabe chief of staff to France and instructed him to take back the military advisors in the whole structure. He didn't accept. However, when he came back to Burkina Faso, the corrupt Burkinabe politicians told him to accept the military advisors, and that's when these military advisors returned to the Burkina army in 2019. It was a disastrous thing to do because the army started disappearing in the following years, 2020 and 2021. This was when many Burkinabe soldiers started deserting the military because there was no hope. This is how the French advisors work in the army. They dictate the policy of the Burkinabe army. It is they who tell us how many to recruit, when to recruit, and what to do. They are also in the schools to tell us how to train the soldiers. As long as these military advisors are there, you are not independent. Your army will just have the appearance of an army that will be doing parade circuses. But when the war comes, you will realize that parade is one thing and war is another thing. We have to break the agreements. This is the only way to have an independent army and to build and be strong. But many people may not understand this. With these agreements, France chooses military officers who will go to train in France. The reality is that after training, these officers come back to their countries to serve the interests of France. Wow, what deep words from President Traore. So, France created a system where African countries would have no choice but to depend on France through its military advisors. Instead of giving sound advice, these military advisors give advice that will only be beneficial to France. What a horrible system. It's baffling that African leaders agreed to this system for so long. Now, Traore said, when we revolted in 2022, a lot of officers who trained in France were immediately contacted to take action because they were trained in France to serve its interest. They do not train them to serve their countries. In many African states, there are plenty of these officers. God knows how many of them are patriots. This is quite interesting. So, those military officers who train in France are spies for France. If you think about it, it is not a far-fetched thing to say. France's claws have indeed eaten deep into every facet of Africa just because it wants to maintain influence in the country. If President Traore did not say all of these, we would not have known the truth. Traore further said, "This is a lesson that Emmanuel Macron has given to the leaders of Africa to catch up and fight against imperialism. In addition to this, Macron insulted all Africans in his words. Macron spoke of ingratitude, but the truth is that he does not see Africans as humans. We stand with Traore on this. Macron's statement is a reflection of his paternalistic attitude towards Africa. He said, he is still awaiting thanks from the Sahel states for Paris's efforts in preventing them from succumbing to militant control. He further added that France made the right decision to intervene in 2013 to combat Islamist militants, despite the fact that those countries have since distanced themselves from French military assistance. In his own words, I think that they forgot to thank us, but that's okay. It will come in time. Macron further added that none of them would have a sovereign state if the French army had not deployed in this region. But isn't this statement ridiculous? First of all, Macron said that France made the right decision to intervene in 2013 to combat Islamist militants in the Sahel region, and that the Sahel countries ought to thank France for preventing them from succumbing to militant control. Frankly speaking, this has got to be the most ridiculous statement ever. Does the Sahel region look like it's free from insecurity caused by the Islamist militants? France spent 10 good years in the Sahel region, supposedly fighting the insecurity. Despite its large military forces and high-grade military equipment, the insecurity continued to increase with each passing year. To make matters worse, France was brought in when the insecurity first started. France was right there when the Islamists were just a few with local weapons. But under France's watch, the jihadists increased and spread all over the region, causing chaos and havoc. And as the insecurity spread, France continued to increase its military might in the region. Macron said France's intervention in the Sahel in 2013 was the right move. Yet, France's intervention, known as Operation Barkhane, is universally regarded as a massive disaster on the part of the French. France does not want to admit it, but everyone knows, including France's allies. Now, the second ridiculous thing that Macron said was that without the French army, there would not have been a sovereign Sahel state. What a stupid statement. How does the presence of the French army in the Sahel correlate to the formation of Burkina Faso, Niger, Mali, and the rest of the Sahel countries as independent states? It seems Macron has forgotten that these countries fought for their independence. People gave their lives to see that these countries were standing on their own, even though the independence was a sham. What Macron should have said was that the presence of the French army in these countries eroded their sovereignty and independence. As Traore confirmed in his speech, France purposely destroyed the militaries of these countries so that they could be dependent on France. Still speaking on the issue, Traore said, if Macron is not an atheist, he should pray for Africans because it is thanks to our ancestors that there is a France today. President Traore is very right in his assertion. History has told us that France was built with African resources. All the beautiful structures and development you see in France today, as well as France's position on the global stage, are all because of Africa. So instead of Macron saying that it is because of the French army that the Sahel countries exist, he should instead say that it is because of the Sahel countries that France exists. Traore's words can be confirmed by some French politicians who have said that without Africa, France would become a third world country. Perhaps Macron knows this, and that is why he has devised a new strategy to maintain its hold in Africa. But African leaders like President Traore are ready to fight to uphold the sovereignty of their countries and will not allow Macron's plan to come to fruition. Other African leaders ought to follow in the footsteps of Traore and the leaders of the Sahel. If things are to change, Africa needs to fight against imperialism and decolonize its mentality. As a French professor said, no one is interested in Africa developing too much because if it develops tomorrow, there will be a problem. This is because the West would no longer have access to cheap resources needed to develop their countries. What are your thoughts? Let us know in the comments section below. Don't forget to like this video, drop a comment, and share.